This is the In Context podcast with your host, Karin von Hippel.
It's a pleasure to welcome you to RUSI's podcast, In Context. Today, we will be speaking with the High Commissioner from Canada to the United Kingdom, Janice Charette. If you haven't heard all of our podcasts, they are online in iTunes, or you can go to the RUSI website to find them. So a warm welcome to Her Excellency Mrs. Janice Charette, the High Commissioner for Canada to the United Kingdom, for Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and Permanent Representative of Canada to the International Maritime Organization. Welcome,
Thank
High
you very
Commissioner.
much, Karin.
You are the second woman in Canadian history to serve as the clerk, pronounced clerk in this country, of the Privy Council, the highest non-elected office in Canada. And you've now been here for 2 years as High Commissioner.
Just over 2 years. I arrived in September of 2016. And curiously, I'm also the second female Canadian High Commissioner here in the UK. The first was Jean Castleman-Watts in 1979.
Wow, that's a long time. That's a
little
big break.
interregnum. That's right, yes.
But this is probably the first time that we have the High Commissioner and the Deputy High Commissioner as both are women.
I think that's a fair statement. That's
and both fabulous women.
Aren't you kind to say?
So the point being that given your really senior experience back home, it tells you that Canada sends their best to the United Kingdom, which is good news for the United Kingdom. And you landed just in time to really help out with Brexit.
Help out. That's we could talk more about that idea, but certainly, in a way, we were just talking in the office today. This is an incredibly privileged position to be in. To represent your country abroad ever is a huge honor, but to be here at such an important time in UK political, economic, social history, and to be part of, at least, an observer of, and hopefully from time to time trying to help in this time and in this situation, it's remarkable. So it hasn't escaped my notice that this is a great posting. Right. But also at a really fascinating
really interesting time. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So what I'd like to do today, if you don't mind, is talk a bit about your background, about your early career. Maybe we'll talk a bit about hockey, and then some questions about leadership, management, etc. And maybe at the end, just some advice for the next generation.
Great.
So why don't we start, not yet with hockey, we'll move on to hockey in a little while, but you're...
Ice hockey, Karin, you have to say.
Ice hockey, you're right.
Yeah.
They play hockey on the grass here with... Yeah. That's right. Yeah, see, I'm from Alaska, so I understand the hockey thing, yeah. But you were born in Ottawa, which is about as unusual as someone being born in Washington, D.C.
It does happen, though. There are maternity wards in hospitals and national capitals. But
turns out.
Yeah, me and my husband and our 2 kids were all born at the same hospital in Ottawa.
And they're now young adults.
They are young adults, exactly.
Okay,
yeah.
Wonderful.
So.
And you went to Carleton University and then went pretty much straight into government, right?
Yeah, I'm like a lot of people. I graduated from university. I was thinking about what I was going to do when I went back to do my master's. I got married. I thought, I'll just take a job in government for a little while and then I'll go back to school. And now it's 2019. So there you go. Things don't always work out according to your plans, but I've had an amazing career so far, despite those origins, which may not have been, as I said, according to my plan.
So you joined government, but actually if we could move back a little bit, what's also interesting is you were the first in your family to go to university, and your mom actually had to stop working as a hairdresser because she got pregnant.
That's right.
So, what motivated you to work versus, thinking that you weren't going to work and become a housewife or whatever? Or did you never think that you wouldn't work?
I don't think it ever crossed my mind. It was certainly a deviation from how our family, and my extended family had been raised. But, I had a great curiosity, and I thought I was going to go out there, and I didn't want to be dependent on anybody else, and I wanted to be able to kind of stand on my own 2 feet.
Did you have any professors that encouraged you in particular, or it was just you? Something was inside you?
No, I guess I have a little bit of an internal drive to do things, and it's served me very well. I've been one of those kind of overachievers since I was all those people you hate. Back in high school, I was the joiner. I joined the student council. I joined this team and that team and this club and that club. And I've always kind of looked for a way to make a contribution, but usually in a setting where it wasn't about me, it was really about a team. So that's also an environment I really think that I do well in. But one of my things that distinguishes my career from a lot of public servants, particularly in Canada, is that I worked in the public service, but I also took leave and worked in the private sector and worked a little bit of time in partisan politics, which is not done as much anymore as it used to be. And I think it really helped me, all of your experiences come together and help to inform your judgment and the way you look at issues and the way you try to manage teams, lead teams, and deliver objectives. Right. So I think it's all about kind of refining competencies and skills as you went along.
Right. No, and I noticed that about your private sector background, and I'll come on to that because I do think there's a lot of lessons that can be drawn from both government and from the private sector. And I think it makes you probably a stronger leader from having a mixed background like that.
Also, managing in government.
Yeah.
I have to say, I think the time that I spent in the private sector, as short a time as it was, really helped me when I started to get into these bigger management jobs. I'd come through in government the policy stream, which is a lot of big cerebral thought, but not necessarily a lot of management of people or money or technology in order to drive results. And when I was in more senior roles where I was trying to do that, I'm really grateful that I had the time where I was refining some of those skills.
You probably shocked the teams. What is she talking about?
Well, it's like, why do you know what an ERP system is? Right. Why do you know about SAP? Right. And it was like, well, because those are hugely important business enablers. And
actually, I think more and more governments are trying to become more professionalized. So those are the right skill sets.
Well, I think we look back and the success of governments is judged hugely by their ability to deliver results and deliver on commitments that they've made, but it's also on the competence of management of governments. And when you look at polling results about how do people feel about their governments, the recency of their experience with a service delivery function, whether it's a benefit receipt or
their
whatever,
driver's license or whatever it is, right,
has a direct correlation with how good they think government performs. So
it just can be scary if it's driver's license.
So, here are citizens who are interacting with banks on their mobile phones. And then, when I was running a big service delivery department that delivered benefits, our idea was IT-enabled services, which you could download the form off of the internet, fill it out by hand, then send it into one of our clerks who would then data enter it. So, there was a bit of a gap between citizen expectations of how they dealt with their private sector suppliers and government. We had to close that gap because it was a credibility and a cost issue as well.
Right. Yeah, no faxing anymore.
Yeah, no faxing, exactly.
But another area I think where you're probably a bit of a trailblazer is that you might have been an early mom who had a stay-at-home husband, right?
I did, yeah.
And so was that normal or was that not normal?
I would say it was pretty much not normal at the time. Like all couples, we had conversations about how we were going to manage this when we had children, and so. If you met my husband, you'd know between the two of us that one of us is better equipped for operating in an environment where you require patience with children. And it was something my husband really, really wanted to do.
Yeah,
so
nice.
I thought it was fantastic that we had that. It's a luxury to have one parent be a stay-at-home parent. And our two kids have fantastic relationships, very different with both of us as a result. But, it was really hard for him. It was really hard. You think about this as like 20
Right, the only dad
at playgroup, right?
Yeah, playgroup or a swimming class or
and so all the moms get together for their kids to have a play date. Well, some of the husbands weren't so comfortable with this dad kind of showing up, right?
Funny. Yeah.
So,
but that's great. I mean, I actually have a lot of friends from my childhood who were the female friends who were the main bread earner, and their husbands were stay-at-home dads. And I do think it's changing. It's positive for society because it doesn't. Kids have different expectations, and they don't necessarily assume that every man does this and every woman does that. So it's nice to mix it up anyway. So
yes, it absolutely is, and it's great to have. It was great for our kids to have a stay-at-home parent. But I really want to. I have huge admiration. I could never have achieved what I've been able to achieve and do in my career without the support of my husband, Reg. He's been a rock.
Right. Well, when you get into these very senior jobs and they're so demanding on your time. So I guess, then let's just say early on you joined the public service in the 80s and you stayed until the mid 90s when you then went into the private sector for a while, right? That's when you went to Ernst & Young and the Canada Pension Plan Investment Board, right?
Right.
And but then you went back into government in 2001. So you were out for about 5 years, 6 years. Yeah.
I also worked in politics at that point in time, which sometimes slips through in the CV and sometimes doesn't.
Okay.
I had worked as a public servant in a number of ministers' offices. And then one particular politician asked me when I was out of the public service to come and be his chief of staff in a partisan role. And I did that not as a partisan, because I'm not a partisan, but really because I believed in that person and his ability and his vision for the country. And it was a fantastic opportunity. It really taught me about a different dimension of politics than I'd seen within government. It was fascinating.
And how did you like being chief of staff?
Fantastic job. Fantastic job. I learned a ton.
Yeah.
I think, I probably learned it on his dime, though, right?
Mm-hmm.
Probably, in some ways, he may have been better off to pick somebody who had a lot more political experience, but that wasn't the way he wanted to run the office. So it was an incredible learning experience. It didn't turn out the way I hoped or I expected, but he went on to greater things, and now I'm Canada's High Commissioner. So I guess in the end, maybe it did work out there.
Right. You never know with these, how these things go. But those are tough jobs because you're behind the scenes and you're basically smashing a lot of heads together, and you have to often be the unfriendly one, the bad cop, whereas the principal gets to be the good cop quite often, right?
Yeah, no, there's no question that is how that division of roles goes. But it's also even more so than the public service. Politics is a team-based activity. And I think back to the memories I have from that relatively short period of time and the team members that I worked with. Those were hugely formative experiences. They stand out in my 30-plus year career as some of the most amazing things that we did.
Yeah, I was a chief of staff for General Allen. That was my last job in the U.S. government. And I have to say, I'm not sure I was a very good chief of staff, but I definitely had to be the bad cop quite often. And, it's quite interesting how, behind the scenes, all that stuff that you just have no idea about until you're in one of those jobs.
You think, I have to do that?
Yeah, right.
Okay.
How to run an office and, also, or anticipate what the boss needs and wants, et cetera. So then you had a series of jobs in various ministries, Health Canada, Immigration Canada, and Citizenship, Human Resources and Skills Development, really good cross-section.
8 or 9 different departments, I think I worked in. Which is characteristic in Canada, actually. You'll see that a senior public servant doesn't necessarily spend their whole career in one department. You kind of are able to take your skill set and use it in a number of different areas.
That's interesting. Yeah. And then
a generalist model.
But the great thing about it actually is that you have a good understanding of all these issues when you then bring them, of course, when you ended up at the mother of all jobs, when you were the clerk of the Privy Council.
The clerk. Which is the cabinet secretary here in the UK, right?
Yeah, it's about the equivalent of the cabinet secretary, isn't it? So basically, it's 3 or 4 jobs in one, isn't it? But as I mentioned, it's the highest non-elected office in Canada. So let's see if I can get this right. You are head of the civil service. You are deputy minister to the prime minister. And therefore head of the department that supports him, which is the PCO, the Privy Council office. And you are secretary to the cabinet, which means you manage all the government's business, legislative agenda, et cetera. I mean, basically
the decision-making processes of government.
How do you do all those jobs?
You have a great team. You have a really great team. And it's absolutely a network job, I would describe it as. So you have a core team that you work with in the Privy Council office, which is your cabinet office, but you also work with a team of deputy ministers, permanent secretaries in the UK context, right across government, and you're only as good as the team that you work with, both in terms of helping you to do your job and you helping them to do their job, because you're trying to, I think a lot of it's about alignment.
Yeah.
It's about people making sure that they understand what's expected of them and then supported to achieve those objectives and helping them when, things are kind of off track. I spent a lot of time in that job. Probably that's the job of all of mine where it crystallized for me just how important the people dimension of my leadership responsibilities were. And I'd seen that at more progressively senior levels. But recruiting, performance management, really meaningful feedback to people about their performance, trying to mentor upcoming public servants, the selection of which person went into which job, all of that human resource management side at the most senior levels became, I would say I probably spent 20+% of my time on that.
Huh. But that was 2 years, and I would imagine your book that you had to bring home every night was just, like an encyclopedia, right?
Yeah, it's a big book.
And who puts that together, too? I mean,
That whole team that I think, sometimes I would say to them, oh, it's a 2-briefcase weekend or a 3-briefcase weekend.
You just get used to reading that stuff so quickly and absorbing vast amounts of information.
Yeah,
right?
well, also triage.
Yeah,
right? I mean, when you went in, my favorite story on this is going into a portable when I was in high school as a grade 9 student and seeing grade 13 math on the wall, right? And thinking, I will never be able to do that, right? But by the time I got to grade 13, I was able to do it. So by the time I became the cabinet secretary, I'd refined a lot of skills that allowed me to figure out how to triage and what was important, what wasn't important, and also to understand what was coming to me may not necessarily be what I needed either. So how to proactively go out there and get the information you need to do your job.
Right.
And
Well, like you're missing
drive
something.
files. Yeah.
You read it and you say, uh-oh.
Yeah, I'm not actually doing this for typos.
Yeah, I know, but you're
That's
missing
not
a big...
real, exactly.
Yeah.
This is the distillation of the advice of the public service to the prime minister or to the cabinet about what they should do about an issue or to achieve a goal. This is the very, very best advice that we have. Have we looked at all the options? Where's the evidence? Where are the risks? You can't do that on every single file and delve down, but you get, I'd have conversations with the prime minister, and from time to time, so what are the 2 or 3 things that you really want me to focus on? What's their worry list? And you figure that out through ongoing conversation.
It's like David Liddington and Mark Sedwell's jobs rolled into one, right?
I think it's Mark Sedwell and John Manzoni's jobs.
Okay.
Yeah, no, I didn't get involved in the political side, so that's really
okay. Stayed out of that, right? Because you weren't an elected politician anyway. Yeah, that's right. That makes sense. And then, did you work like every weekend and late into the night, or did you figure out a way to do your work-life balance?
I wouldn't say that I am the poster child for work-life balance. I think probably my biggest challenge there is my own appetite. Right? I have a huge curiosity about issues, which got me involved in more things than I probably should have been. I work really hard. There's no question about that. But I also have a huge curiosity about people. And so I would probably spend more time talking to people than I had available to do that. And so that ended up just meant I burnt a lot of midnight oil. As my kids were going through high school, Sundays were always work days. So the kitchen table on Sundays, I worked all day, and they were doing their homework along with me. So those are kind of the fun memories, actually, in a funny way. Sort
of bonding that way. But that must have made, in a sense, having had that experience must have made the current job a bit more manageable, because this was like way fewer portfolios in a sense, right?
It's a completely different job in a way. I mean, you still have a whole of government perspective, right? Which, as the cabinet secretary or the clerk, you are a whole of government person. That's how you think, is whole of government. And in this job, I am absolutely the representative of the government of Canada. But it's a very outwardly focused job here, as opposed to in my last job where I was much more inwardly focused. I would absorb information, synthesize information, and feed it up, and then implement, execute decisions. Our catchphrase was, fearless advice and then loyal implementation. And here, really, I spent a lot of my time with that outward focus, kind of projecting messages, talking about Canada, talking about our goals and objectives, our strengths, and trying to brand Canada here in the UK. And so I describe the hours are probably about the same, because this is the UK, and so there's just an awful lot going on all the time, and I take on too many things because I have this curiosity, and there's an appetite to hear about Canada these days, which is terrific. But I don't have that kind of same stress level associated with the stakes in some ways of sitting across from a prime minister or feeding a cabinet on a daily basis.
Right. And then between you and your deputy, does she do more of the internal management, or how do you guys divide up the workload?
Yeah, so my deputy high commissioner is Sarah Fountain Smith, I am very blessed to have Sarah as my number 2. She's a very experienced and highly skilled diplomat, which I am not. And so she's helping me to be a better High Commissioner. And so we spent a lot of time between the two of us trying to figure out how best to spend our time, the most precious, non-renewable resource that we have. And absolutely, she takes the lion's share of the kind of the management of the mission and the kind of keeping of the trains running on time. I still delve into the human resource management side because I have an interest in the mentoring and the coaching side of it. We kind of jointly share planning responsibilities, but she kind of keeps the mission running. And I try to do the outward focus things, but there's lots to do.
Right.
So we both, we try to be substitutes for each other, so that if you can't have one, you can have the other, without necessarily feeling like you're trading up or trading down.
Right.
So,
It's a team.
Absolutely.
And then who deals with the International Maritime Organization?
Actually, we have a superb woman from Transport Canada who is the full-time person who deals with the IMO. And then both Sarah and I, Sarah's my alternate, and we're the 1-2 punch as well at the International Maritime Organization. So, we have a workshop coming up later this month on noise, which is a fascinating issue in the maritime world. It's about the degree to which you can reduce noise of seagoing vessels, which has an impact on marine mammal population, particularly, say, for example, off the coast of the west coast of Canada. If you have vessels that are transporting LNG or oil products off the coast of Vancouver, they have to come through a very sensitive area. And so how can you reduce the noise and still be able to get the product through, right? So you have less disturbance on the environment. Canada's played a lead role in terms of some of the science and the safety issues around transport in the Arctic, which as we're starting to see more shipping happening in those waters, it's not like shipping around the Gulf of Mexico. Right. And so trying to build up the international rules around that. And actually, I'm doing something with the Secretary General of the IMO later this year, I think in June, around mental health of seafarers. When you think about, when you sign up to be on one of these ships, you could be away from your family in a close quarters, and so what do you do about mental health and resilience?
Right. But what about, this may be a very stupid question, but if you're worried about noise for, fish and the larger underwater animals, what about the sea lions and all those ones that hang around and all of them?
All of a piece.
They get impacted by noise
it's all
above
of a piece.
as well. Oh, interesting.
It's all of a piece.
I never would have thought about that before, but of course it makes a lot of sense.
Well, we have to bring it to the International Maritime Organization a bit more, don't we?
And how many Canadians are there in the UK that you know of?
We have. I'm afraid to tell you this. I have no idea. It's there are so many dual citizens, for example. And because the UK has been for a relatively safe and secure place, we don't run the same kind of registries, or people don't tend to register as much. But I couldn't even guess. I couldn't even guess.
Well, they're dual nationals, but then there'll be lots of Canadians just working here that don't have two passports as well.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
Yeah. And presumably they're mostly living in London and...
No, you'll find them all over, actually. No, you'll absolutely find them all over. People who've come back at some point in time, or people who've come here to go to school. There's lots of Canadian students studying in UK universities, not just here in London. So up at St. Andrews or maybe Queen's University Belfast, there's a good contingent of Canadians, particularly in their law school there.
Yeah, interesting. So in terms of dealing with all sorts of issues like that, and some could be high profile. For example, the Canadian researcher that's now been detained in China. But if, say someone was detained here, that would be your consular section, presumably, that deals with all that. But presumably, if it became high profile enough, be you or the Deputy High Commissioner that would get involved as well.
Absolutely, yeah.
Right. Fortunately, Canadians are pretty law-abiding generally.
Yeah, well, we like to think of ourselves that way, but, every country has their share. Right,
every country has their share.
Right.
But also, I think it's a very interesting time to be here as well because, in a sense, it seems like the world order has been shaken a bit and, America's withdrawing a bit. And there's this whole conversation, I think, about like-minded countries trying to figure out who will be the standard bearer of the, the values that so many of our societies have supported since the end of the Second World War. And it seems like in many ways, this country's been so distracted by Brexit. Trump is a distraction in and of himself. Many other Europeans are distracted by all sorts of populist politicians, migration issues. So it seems like the Canadian Prime Minister is now the leader of the free world.
Well, I don't think that's a post he ran for, but I think there's no question that we are at a challenging time. in terms of what's called the rules-based international order, which is kind of the way the world we thought was supposed to work, and the kind of an unwritten convention of how it has worked basically since the end of the Second World War, since the setup of the Bretton Woods institutions and so on. And for a lot of reasons that are, obvious, we have countries who weren't necessarily part of those conversations. Think about, how many billions of people in China and India who, or, what do we used to call them? The BRICS countries, Brazil, the South Africans, the Indians, the Chinese, who weren't necessarily part of those conversations at the time. So we have a set of global institutions, which is how we have been able to manage those global international issues, the issues of the international commons, which don't necessarily represent how the economic or the demographic power of the world is now distributed. At the same time as countries are, revisiting, as you said, with the United States and some others, their commitment to multilateralism and whether or not they think that their country's objectives are best served working in common or working on their own. I think, Canada's a traditional middle power in this respect. We're 36 million people with a heck of a lot of land. And we've always seen ourselves as as a country that is better off in a world where multilateral institutions, and we solve our problems working together. Right. We solve our problems working together. And that we think we have a positive contribution to make to this debate and discussion. And I think that Prime Minister Trudeau and his government have very much tried to represent that since 2015 when his government took over. And one of the first statements from the Prime Minister at the time was Canada's back. Yeah. So what has that meant since then? Well, Canada's been back in a number of different ways, trying to champion issues which we think go to the heart of what citizens really think is important in this rules-based international order. So issues of gender equality and diversity, and why migration is a good thing, and championing human rights issues, and fair and inclusive and progressive trade, not just about economic issues, but how can we see trade that also advances labor rights and environmental issues. It's one of the reasons why Canada's pursuing a seat on the UN Security Council, because we think that the UN is one of our most important institutions in terms of this body around these global issues. And so we think we have a positive contribution to make there, and not just on behalf of ourselves, but, for example, as a Commonwealth country, to be able to carry the issues of Commonwealth countries to that table and to that discussion. The francophonie, nous sommes membres des deux organisations en même temps. We're members of both organizations. I just said to Karin, who smiled at me. So we have, we're a big joiner of these clubs and alliances, because we do think we do better working with others. Yeah,
and the UN really does need bolstering right now too. It just seems to have lost its mojo a bit. But another interesting thing about Canada is that it's probably one of the few countries that has not had this populist backlash. And I wonder if it's because you didn't have the financial crisis that many other countries have had. Australia is another one that hasn't really, Australia's had immigration challenges, but I wonder why Canada, it seems to have passed you by. You may have some small pockets, but you don't seem to be experiencing the same challenges that many other European, United States countries are.
Well, first of all, no country is immune, I think. And we've seen, certainly in the last few months, that these things can pop out of nowhere very quickly. The Gilets jaunes, for example, in Paris, that came quite quickly.
Right, that's true.
And so, so we can't be immune, and we have to be thinking about what do we do to maintain the consensus in our country that actually we more or less are working in a way that is not just about some, but for all. And I think that, part of this, the migration issue, which has tended to be one of the more divisive issues in countries where we've seen this populist revolt, or these populist uprisings happening. Canada is a country of immigrants. You won't talk to too many Canadians that don't have, first, second, third generation immigration stories. My mom came to Canada from the Netherlands at the end of the Second World War. So, I'm 50%. 50% of my background is an immigration story. So the fact that so many of us come from other parts of the world mean that in the debate and discussion on domestic issues in Canada, it's informed by not just a Canadian perspective, but the perspective of, the recent immigrant from the Philippines or from India or from China or from Poland or from whatever.
Canada's a mosaic, right? The United States has always been the melting pot, and Canada's a mosaic, meaning tiles side by side, but not necessarily losing your individual, your culture, right? Isn't that the purpose?
Many politicians have tried to find the expression of what Canada is. Everyone's been challenged. I remember the community of communities was a Joe Clark expression back in the late 70s. It's a country where you can be a Canadian and you can still celebrate your own cultural and ethnic origins. But I think that the really crucial issue in all of this is the degree to which there's still a shared values question. And when that starts to get questioned, that's where I think the consensus can fracture.
It's interesting, though, because, of course, the United States is that as well. And it seems to be losing sight of the fact that it's an immigrant country. It's also interesting to me about the United Kingdom. I mean, I've lived here for about 20 years, and it really has evolved in the way that it views itself as more of a melting pot today, certainly, than it was in the past. I mean, I think there's much more recognition that Britain is a multicultural place, but I'm not sure they've embraced it in the same way as Canada.
I think London's a very multicultural place.
Yeah, but even you go up to Birmingham and you go, lots different parts of the country, you will see it's much more multicultural than it certainly has been in the past.
I'm just not sure that they would necessarily think of themselves that way.
Yeah, but it's certainly in
Scotland. Go to Scotland, they really do see immigration as a critical ingredient of their success as well. So I really found this when I was the Deputy Minister of Citizenship and Immigration in Canada. I was the heading up of the department that thought that they were building Canada through the decisions they were making about welcoming newcomers to Canada. So it's a really it's an interesting part of who we are as a country.
I remember once, I don't know if it's the same still, but I went to Canada and at the airport, there didn't seem to be a queue for Canadians.
No.
Everyone was in the same long queue. And I thought, oh my gosh, they really are so polite.
Yeah, well, egalitarian.
Yeah.
Part of it is, and maybe, we have this in common with our Alaskan friends. You know what? It's, we are a very communitarian this collective sounds like socialism, but we're a country that, we band together for survival, we freeze to death or something like that, right? So there is a view that we're kind of all in this together.
Well, Alaskans are more libertarian, so I'm not sure I would put them in that same category.
We'll believe them on their skidoos.
Yeah, exactly. It is interesting. I mean, in some ways, probably that part of Canada closer to Alaska may be similar because it's, the great outdoors and it's, more survivalist. But, maybe... So, we have talked about these various jobs that you've had. I mean, what always interests me is views on leadership and team building, the pros and cons of diversity in teams and diverse ways of thinking. And I know you think it's very important to be surrounded by people who don't agree with you and to make sure that you don't get the group think, right? I mean, what would you say that for you are the really critical issues about leadership?
So, leadership's not about having a grand vision necessarily or having all the answers. In my view, it's about being able to work with people to chart a course, even where you don't have all the answers, where there can be ambiguity, and you have enough of a following. Leadership without followers is a bit of a delusion. You have enough people that you can motivate and inspire to come with you to help you to achieve that objective, whatever that is. And so, how do you develop people in an environment where they feel like they actually can contribute their best, and they're motivated and they're inspired and they're supported to be able to give their very best. I've had a predilection for hiring people who are smarter than me, people with very diverse perspectives. One of the hardest things I've ever had to experienced is how do you create an environment, though, particularly when you get into more senior roles, where people feel like they can actually tell you what they think, as opposed to waiting to kind of see where the wind blows and whether or not they're saying something that, like, they're trying to tell you what you want to hear, which is dangerous and a killer, right? So how do you get them to feel like they can be creative and be innovative and actually challenge your thinking? And you have to work really hard on that subtle subtle, even body language when somebody's telling you something that you know challenges what you're thinking. But nothing like which is why it takes me so long to do my job some days. Nothing I like better than actually pulling 10 people around a table and actually having a debate and discussion about the ideas, not about the people. I'm a big believer in trying to support those conversations in a workforce where that is non-hierarchical, that really is trying to bring out the best across the organization, that people have a chance to, even if they're not succeeding in one role, they may have a chance to go and do something else where they maybe have a better fit. And a little bit of patience along the way matters a whole lot in that respect. But to have the support of your team and to feel like you can only succeed when you're working together, that's really the environment that I've been trying to create in my career.
And then in terms of diversity, all sorts of diversity, whether it's having different government backgrounds or having grown up in different parts or the gender or all, there are all sorts of issues that people usually say makes for better team, better thinking.
Well, think about it, particularly in public service and in government. If you are trying to represent the country, then in some ways you have to be representative of the diversity of the country. Right. And so that's, regional backgrounds and ethnicity and demography and gender, and there's all kinds of measures of diversity. But, and I think you get richer discussions. I think you're better able to see different risks. You're able to see different opportunities. But I should just pause on gender for a second, because that, I think, as a female leader, as you said, the second female cabinet secretary, the second female high commissioner here, I've had an interesting journey. I probably earlier on in my career would have resisted being described as a female leader. I was a leader, and I didn't think my gender had anything to do with it. But over time, I've come to understand that I've been very fortunate to think that way, because a lot of women came ahead of me and blazed a lot of trails and cut a lot of grass to allow me to feel that way, and that actually. As Madeleine Albright says, there's a special place in hell for women who don't help other women. So I've made it a real priority to try and help champion and support women to achieve and succeed in leadership roles. And I think that we made a heck of a lot of progress on that, but we still have a long way to go.
Yeah. Well, I hear that a lot too. As you know, I'm the first female director of RUSI, right? Woo-hoo. And so I get that quite often.
People look up to you, right? That's probably the reason that of all the things, that's probably the thing that made me focus on this more than anything, is the number of young women who were trying to have children, who were trying to, have successful careers at the same time, just how important they felt having a role model or somebody who, if they can see it, they can be it.
Right.
I'm not a rocket scientist. I'm not some kind of a genius, right? I worked really hard, and, I got to achieve some really important and wonderful roles.
Right.
And so can they.
Right. But also, the Canadian government has been a leader in issues related to gender, whether it's, women in peace and security, or in fact, I think your prime minister has been very good about is half the cabinet are women, right?
And from the day he
practicing what you preach, basically.
From the day he set up his first cabinet, it was 50% female, and we've seen that now carried out in both in the domestic and in the foreign policy space. The Prime Minister has created an environment where we have championed a feminist international assistance policy. We've been very big sponsors of women in peace and security. We're going to have our first ambassador for women in peace and security. We've been working hard on something called the ELSI Initiative for women in peacekeeping roles. We have sponsored a lot of our development funding is going as part of the Feminist International Assistance Policy in support of how we drive the development of women and girls, particularly in developing societies. The Prime Minister created the first ever Gender Advisory Council to G7 leaders and had them in the room talking to G7 leaders at the summit in Quebec in June. So those issues, and it wasn't a conversation about gender as gender, it was a conversation about how gender informs all the issues that were on the summit agenda, whether it was, economic prosperity, peace and security, cybersecurity, whatever it was, there was a gender dimension to that. So I think it's been part of value proposition of Canada on the international stage.
Well, that's great. Years ago, and I was working in Kosovo for the UN, when I actually worked with a number of Canadian diplomats who I'm still in touch with, we were pushing very hard on the Kosovars. We at the UN were pushing on the Kosovars at 25% women in their police force and in their new whatever the military was called. And then, of course, you looked around us at the UN and we didn't have 25%.
Right.
And it's a bit, hypocritical, let's just say. Yeah.
Right.
So it's nice that you are practicing what you preach.
But so, we have made progress. Our numbers, for example, in the public service in Canada are really good. We have probably the highest rate of female executives in the public service compared to any other country that I've seen. And we've all read the McKinsey-type studies in terms of the value of diversity and gender equality in terms of private sector firms, how that translates to bottom line profits and so on. But, the reality is cultural barriers still exist. There are still big challenges. And so this is something I think we have to continue to work on.
No, that makes sense. Now, we're running out of time, and I know it's a Friday afternoon, and you've been very kind to come over here. I guess a couple just final questions. In terms of, as this country, as the United Kingdom, thinks more about what global Britain means, how does Canada, what's Canada's view on that and the UK-Canada relationship going forward?
I think we see this as a really interesting moment of opportunity. Canada and the United Kingdom have had a very long and very deep and hugely valuable relationship. We started out as a colony of the United Kingdom, and it's fair to say that we have many things in common. We share a sovereign. We have a common law tradition. We have the Westminster parliamentary tradition. We speak more or less English, although some expressions I still struggle with. But there's a risk that because of those things that we have in common, including, think back to Canada was one of the countries that lost more men and women in World War I and World War II in support of the United Kingdom than a lot of other countries. So, we've shed our share of blood as well in support of this relationship. There's a risk, though, that you can take those relationships for granted. And I think that as the UK considers its future outside of the European Union and is charting this course for a global Britain, whatever that is going to come to mean, there's an opportunity for Canada and the UK to look again in a fresh way at our relationship. And Prime Minister Trudeau and Prime Minister May agreed in September of 2017, so before she went off to UNGA, not last year, but the year before, to actually put in place an action plan for the Canada-UK relationship, which saw us trying to deepen and broaden the areas in which we're collaborating. So, we have a tremendous range of collaboration on things like peace and security and development and diplomacy and so on, but we're actually looking at new areas. So, for example, science, technology, research, and innovation. There's actually a remarkable synergy between UK priorities in this space and Canadian priorities in this space. So as the UK moves out of the European universe on these things, there are huge opportunities, I think, from an economic, but also from a scientific discovery and translation to what it's going to mean for public policy purposes to collaborate in those areas. And so we have a really, I think, an ambitious action plan. We've been working away on it now for over a year and a half. We are underpinning it with some what I call plumbing and wiring. So there's to be a 3+3 annual dialogue between our ministers of development, defense, and foreign affairs. Great. 3+3, which we're working to organize. There is official level contact. So the two cabinet secretaries chair an annual meeting where they bring together their senior colleagues to look at issues of public administration. So this relationship should be something where we have, thematic priorities that come and go, but we have deepened the person-to-person contacts that support the relationship. So I think, a lot of countries are reflecting on this right now in terms of as the UK evolves from where it has been to now kind of a standalone country outside the EU.
Seize on the opportunities makes sense.
And also reinforce some priorities that may not necessarily have been as high a priority for the UK in the past. So.
Okay. Any thoughts about ice hockey before I ask you Your final question?
I'm a hockey mom. I think that's a pretty well-known fact. Both of my kids played competitive ice hockey. For me, it's a really interesting, not only because it was great and kept them off the streets and kept them physically fit, but hockey in Canada is, it's our national sport, but it's also a phenomenon. Is it the same way in Alaska? I wonder that. But Saturday mornings, standing around a freezing cold arena at 7:30 on a Saturday morning when it's like minus 30 degrees outside, everybody's kind of bundled up in their coats, the parents standing around watching their kids on the ice, and it can be boys or it can be girls, and they, all of us have a cup of something hot in our hands, usually a Tim Hortons coffee. It doesn't really matter whether your kid is brown or white or green or orange or striped, or where you've come from. It's an amazing thing. It is something which really brings people together.
Yeah.
And because it's so important to us of who we are, I think it's probably one of the kind of unique or interesting settlement opportunities we have for how do we really integrate newcomers to Canada into what it means to be Canadian.
Wherever they're from, right?
Yeah,
Even
Syrian
if they're from
refugees.
Somalia or something.
Yeah, Syrian refugees, who probably weren't playing a whole lot of ice hockey in Syria before they came to Canada.
Actually, when I got to Yale, I played tennis in high school, and the tennis coach wasn't interested in me, but the ice hockey coach was saying, why aren't you coming out? And I'm like, look at me. Do you think I could play hockey?
You look
I'd
fast.
get killed.
You look fast to me.
That's horrible, but anyway.
My kids were both goalies, so have some sympathy for me.
Yeah. So I always ask in these podcasts, advice for the next generation, for people who are thinking of a career in politics, foreign affairs, security, the range of things that we all enjoy and love. What advice would you give to the next generation?
I guess I'd say two things to that. One of them is have the courage of your convictions, right? Don't get discouraged. Don't let people trying to live up to your ambitions. Have big goals, have big ambitions, dream big, and try to live up to them and deliver on them. I find that sometimes, particularly if you're going into a bureaucratic environment or a hierarchical environment, you can get kind of ground down by levels and processes and things like that. But you're there to change it, not to become part of it, right? So be creative, be innovative, challenge the status quo, stand up for what you think is important, and be counted. I think that we need all the voices, and young voices with different perspectives should be molding our institutions as much as me, old codger types like me. And the second thing I would say is invest in your personal resilience. Because the world will throw curveballs at you.
Yeah.
And that could be in your personal life, it could be in your professional life.
Sleep.
Oh my God, sleep. The really basic things that are good for your mental health, right?
Yeah.
Sleep, exercise,
Eating
don't
well.
work all the time,
Right.
eating well, kind of being aware of your surroundings, having people to talk to. You're not really helping anybody if you spend your whole life working. You need perspective.
Yeah.
And so your personal resilience is we live in times which can be stressful, they can be chaotic, where change is ubiquitous and it's just going to speed up. So how do you build in your resilience to be able to deal with that? I think that'll make you more effective.
Those are great pieces of advice. Dream big and take care of yourself.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's
absolutely
excellent. Well, Canadian High Commissioner Janice Charette, it's been a huge pleasure today welcoming you to RUSI, and thank you for coming in on this cold Friday afternoon.
Oh, it's not cold, Karin.
That's true.
It's London cold.
Compared to where we've both been, but I'm cold.
Thank you for having me,
Thank
Karin.
you so
it's been
much.
Great.
Thank you for joining us for today's podcast in context with High Commissioner Janice Charette from Canada. In our next podcast, we will be speaking to a former High Commissioner from Australia to the United Kingdom, the Honourable Alexander Downer. Please do join us.
This podcast was produced by Tom Ascott, developed by Caroline Tranter, with further research from Neil Watling. Keep up to date with the latest defence and security analysis by visiting www.rusi.org.